Hi, and everybody who's already here. Just a quick announcement. As you can see on the countdown, there's still some time left. I hope everybody can hear me well. I think all your audios are connected. So happy to be here, and just keep patience for a little while longer, and then we're going online in just 7 minutes. See you soon. Hi and welcome everybody. As you can see, we have a little bit of time left. So if you want to make use of the time and introduce yourself in the chat real quick so we know where you're tuning in from, just if you want to. So feel free to do that. In the meantime, hope you're already hearing me and comfortable. So soon we're going to be on air, and welcome everybody officially. See you soon. Hi and welcome everybody. Really happy to have you here today. Today, again, let's create impact together now live. And today we have the topic transforming societies with circular economy. Today we have a special guest, Catherine from the UK. Hi, Catherine. How are you doing? See, your microphone is still muted. Ah, there. And the camera. There you go. Hi.
Oh.
Gone again. There you are.
Hi, Philippe. Thanks for
Hi.
inviting me along.
Really happy to have you here. As you might know, and somebody of the audience might know Catherine already, and I'm really happy to have you here in the show today. Catherine is a real expert on the circular economy, and she will talk about her new book today, but also about her company and what she's doing and her vision for how the circular economy can help to transform today's society and tackle the issues we need to deal with. So I'm really happy to have you here. So let's jump into the agenda of today. Just real quick, we'll talk about what is the circular economy, just from my perspective. But as you know, we have the expert here, so don't worry. We will talk about it the whole evening. Then we have the chance to listen to Catherine's life story a little bit. I have some questions for her, and then we'll have her presenting insights on the circular economy. She has some nice slides for us presented, and we have the chance to then talk to her and ask all kinds of questions to her and to me. If you want to, feel free to. And yes, we can have an exchange of ideas, comments, questions, and at the end we have a couple of calls to action, some links where you can follow up with what we're doing. So let's jump into the topic and let's see what's the circular economy. Well, like the name obviously suggests, we want an economy that is circulating. But what does that actually mean? It means going from a linear model, which we have right now in most cases, from the cradle to the grave, basically, from extraction of resources, processing them, then making products with them or services to the disposal. But then maybe it ends up in landfills or in the ocean, worst case, or somewhere else in the environment. And the idea of a circular economy is to create circles, because nature works in circles. In nature, there is no such thing as waste. So that's the idea of a circular economy, an economy which is closer to how nature works, and that is basically the best way to preserve nature. But it's not just about the environmental aspect. Circular economy also has to do a lot with collaboration and with social economics, but we'll leave that for further on. What you see here are the two famous cycles or circles, the biological cycle and the technical cycle. And as you can imagine, some things are not degradable when it comes to maybe some sort of plastics or a washing machine. When you dig it into the ground, it's one day maybe it will disappear somehow, but it's not really degradable. I think on that we can agree. Other materials like an apple, you put into the ground and degrades, everything is fine. No, so the idea is if we have technical things that have to be used, then they should be prolonged or going back into the circle in all kinds of ways how we can bring it back to life, basically. No, and then the other hand, we need maybe new materials that allow us to produce certain things like plastics, because we see how important plastics are, for example, during a pandemic. But we also agree on that all that kind of plastic is maybe, and not just maybe, really bad for the environment. No? So we need to maybe think of bioplastics that under certain conditions then degrade again and go back into the biological cycle. No? So this is the idea that basically production systems, the whole value chain from the consumption, everything has to be transformed. And so it either goes into the technical or the biological cycle, if you want to simplify the idea. But as you know, we have today Catherine here to tell us much more about the circular economy and aspects that are important with it, and also going beyond maybe circular economy, knowing that what we see also on the political agenda maybe has some drawbacks, and we need to maybe take into consideration more things than just having things in a circular way. Let's look at your story a little bit, Catherine. As you can see here on the slide, Catherine is an international speaker, workshop facilitator, coach, consultant, and host of the Circular Economy podcast. Maybe you know her also from there. She's the founder of Rethink Global and the author of an award-winning book, A Circular Economy Handbook: How to Build a More Resilient, Competitive, and Sustainable Business. Her background: she's an industrial engineer, began her career in garment manufacturing before moving on to logistics, solution design, project management, business intelligence, and supply chain consulting, including senior roles with Tesco, Kellogg's, and DHL supply chain. As you can see, quite interesting experience you have already and broad. You've worked in bigger companies, which nowadays we would maybe not consider as the most sustainable ones. So maybe that is even what brought you to the sustainability community. So let me ask you, how did you come up with the Circular Economy podcast? This is my first curiosity I have for you.
I guess I'd been listening to a few podcasts, and one in particular which was about business books, so nothing to do with sustainability, but realized that it was a great way of interviewing people who were actually doing things and getting their story out to the world. So after probably over a year's worth of procrastination, finally got going nearly 2 years ago now.
Oh wow! And since now it's 2 years ago, so what would you think for you as most remarkable insights or projects? Like, is there what are the most remarkable things that stuck to you that you remember, and maybe that even changed your own life in a way?
Yeah, I guess it's always encouraging to hear the stories. And I suppose what surprised me is the number of small businesses that I found that have been doing it for over a decade already. When I first started researching examples for the book, I really struggled in some sectors to find any kind of credible example. And then over the years, that's changed. So now, there are too many examples to keep track of. And I always sensed from starting to collect examples in a database, which we could maybe talk about later because that's going public now, then I had already worked out that lots more small businesses were doing circular things than the larger businesses. And of course, it's easier to change your strategy if you're quite small and maneuverable rather than being like a super tanker, the likes of DHL, Kellogg's, and so on. So that kind of all made sense. But just the number of businesses that have been doing this already for over 10 years was surprising.
So it's quite curious that you say that even for smaller companies, you see it's in a way easier. And I always would assume that for smaller enterprises, they face maybe bigger challenges in a way. Maybe they lack the resources to innovate on materials and these kind of things. But you also say in a certain way, they have it easier maybe to switch to a circular strategy, or maybe they have already lots of circular strategies in place. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, I think it's easier for smaller businesses to switch because you're not fighting against so much of a fixed momentum. You've probably got a smaller team that you've got to get on board and convince. You can have conversations with everybody that matters. I think so often we see in big companies, we might see interesting pilot projects, and then often that gets squashed by business as usual. And by, lots of companies have um, a shareholder ownership structure. And we just saw last week that Danone, who'd been doing quite a lot on regenerative agriculture and some interesting things on circular economy, their CEO was forced out because he was thought to be focusing too much on sustainability and not enough on short term results. So activist investors forced him out. And Unilever have had to push quite hard against doing things like quarterly reporting. So I think if you're a small business, it's easier to try things, it's easier to get the whole team on board. And there's less politics being played. I always remember the story of Kodak and how they employed the person who invented the digital camera, but the division making traditional film was so powerful within the company that they just squashed the idea, and Kodak ended up going bust.
Interesting story. Yeah, I heard about that too. That shows how when you resist to change, you can maybe end up uh, somewhere else. No, yeah, it's
Yeah.
intriguing, and that's also why I like to talk about circular economy. Now we have everybody's talking about, or before Corona, people were talking about the Green Deal and how the Green Deal would change our landscape with investment in the circular economy. So, do you really see this transition coming to a full circular economy?
Yeah, I do. Not particularly because of things like the Green Deal, though I think those policy changes are needed to level the playing field. But I think it's coming more from employees and customers expecting businesses to be doing things the right way and starting to be quite shocked when they find out that that's not what's happening at all. Um, and I think also there's a lot more pressure from certain groups of shareholders, not that activist investor that we talked about earlier, but there's a lot of growth in something called ESG funds, environmental, social, and governance all coming together. So governance being, more than just the kind of uh, legal minimums in terms of what rules sit around your company. So that's coming to the fore, and more investors are looking for that. So I think it's kind of, it's all coming from that direction. But what we need is policymakers to really get on and do things with green taxes, and really help level the playing field.
Interesting, interesting. Yeah, we will talk about that probably also a bit more at the end. Um, I have one or two more questions for you when it comes to Rethink Global. So actually, what are you doing at Rethink Global? Is my first question. And how did you come up with founding your own company?
Yeah, so that was a kind of slow realization over the last few years of my career that I was just making a tiny bit of difference in a massive company with over 500,000 employees. So making a tiny bit of difference and actually helping our big customers, big electrical retailers, big DIY retailers, clothing and so on, helping them get a little bit more efficient. And really that was in opposition to everything I believed in. None of them were on a sustainability journey. And so I decided that, it was time to step off that corporate treadmill, if you like, and do something different. So that was the idea for the company. And I felt that I wanted to help people understand the circular economy and be able to use it. So, and I guess it started with a broader thing more around sustainability. But then, within the first year or so, realizing that the circular economy was probably the best toolkit that we had to take us on that sustainable journey. So I've just been focusing on trying to do things that people can digest easily. So try to make it as understandable as possible, and give people the tools to start moving their company towards doing things in a more circular way, and try and do that in bite-sized chunks. So you can just start with one part of the supply chain and just with one pilot or one small scale test, and take baby steps.
Interesting. So yeah, that actually gives me now the opportunity to pass over to you if you want to, and you can present the topic for today of your slides, and after that, everybody will have the chance to ask some questions. So now, whether you have questions, you can already start writing in the chat. So we always keep them for further notice, so nothing should get lost on the way. And if so, please write me a message. Hey, Philip, I wrote a question earlier. Can you please check it again? So excuse me beforehand if some question might get along lost on the way, but it shouldn't. So at the end, we obviously recuperate everything. So now, again, Catherine, I'm really happy to have you here. So I'm really curious now, looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Philip. So, okay, so this is the town close to where I grew up, Huddersfield in West Yorkshire, which used to be one of the richest towns in England in the Industrial Revolution. So, founded on textiles, and then a lot of the industries that went along with textiles. So, engineering being a big thing, and it's probably best known now for its engineering. And somewhere on here is I should have should have pinned this earlier. Somewhere on here. Oh, there it is. The Huddersfield University, where I used to go down on the bus from school to do my computer studies O level. When we were using, we had to use punch tape for the first program that we did. And then we graduated to punch cards, which were a lot better because if you made a mistake on one line of code, you only had to change one card. So yeah, but I couldn't wait to get away at 18. We didn't live in the town; we lived out of the town. But just this whole industrial landscape, just wasn't good for me. So the older I've got, the further away from towns and cities I've wanted to be, and this is where I live now. So if you can see, they're just kind of over here-ish. So this is the Yorkshire Dales National Park, and all that purple is the heather that goes into flower in August, and it's then full of bees, which is brilliant. And then there's my kind of corporate career. So starting off working in clothing manufacture, training as an industrial engineer, and then moving into food for Tesco and then for Kellogg's, and then moving into logistics. So I guess you could kind of describe that as a bit of a wiggly, haphazard career is how it looks. And then since leaving the corporate world, I suppose the big breakthrough, if you like, was being commissioned to write a book, which started off, I was asked, could I write a book on waste in the supply chain? And I was kind of thinking, well, I'm sure I could if I, spent enough time researching it, but who's going to buy a book on that? And it was at the time I was thinking about circular economy, and I was on my way to a circular economy event in London, and there was a publisher there, so I got talking to her, and she said, well, why don't you make it about the circular economy and supply chain? So I thought, oh, that's a good idea. So I went back to the publisher and said, what do you think about this? And that was the beginning of what was probably one of the hardest projects I've ever done, certainly harder than writing my MSc thesis. And then starting the podcast back in 2016, 2018, as Philip said. And then last year, I was asked to write an update and do a second edition for the Circular Economy Handbook. And that ended up being nearly as big a project as the first one because things had moved on so much. And I was quite interested to go back to a lot of the examples that I'd included in the first book. So there were well over 100 different examples. And there were one or two that I'd kind of looked at the time and thought, is this real? Or is this just somebody putting out some interesting circular wash PR? And there was one that I'd seen that said Heinz and Ford were collaborating on a project to use waste, the waste skins from tomatoes, from Heinz tomato soup and tomato ketchup, and turning those into fabric to use in Ford cars. And I even put in the book that, it wasn't, this press release didn't come out on April Fool's Day. So, but sure enough, when I went back to look at what had happened afterwards, from 2015 onwards, I couldn't see any sign of it. So I was pleased to delete that one and put in another 100 or so better examples instead. So this is the photo of a sewing room floor from the 1980s. It's not the one where I worked, but it looks very similar. So that's in the UK, and one of the, I guess it was quite a good understanding that I ended up with from working in those roles. I used to work in design costing as well for Warner's, the lingerie company there on the right. So that meant taking design ideas from we had about half a dozen different designers, and they would put together a mock-up of something that could go into production, and then we had to work out how many how much elastic was in there, how much of each different fabric, and that meant doing layups and all sorts of things. So it's good understanding into just how things go together, and the complexity of doing costings and meeting price targets and that kind of thing. So I guess thinking about my career, there've been some recurring themes. Productivity from the industrial engineering. I've been involved in quite a lot of systems design, though it was never sort of badged as that. But when I think back about it, I designed software systems at Kellogg's to help with our pallet loss problem and solved a £1 million problem that we had with lost pallets. I've designed knowledge sharing systems at Kellogg's. I've designed systems for getting products through a warehouse at Tesco when we brought different temperature groups of food together in the first what were called composite warehouses in the UK, with about 7 different temperature regimes in the same warehouse. So working out how we were going to access all that in a productive way. So all sorts of different systems. And I guess even though I've never formally studied systems thinking, I can really see the importance of that and see how unforeseen consequences can trip you up if you don't sit back and think about, what could go wrong with this project, what might we not have thought of, where's there a potential for scope creep and all that kind of thing. And as I've been working on the circular economy and looking at some of the examples and the stories out there, and looking at some of the papers and the research, especially from large consultancies, then I've started to become a bit more skeptical about some of the messages. And it really worries me when, the reports lead with the idea that the circular economy can be a way to continue growth. Because we all know when we think about it that everything that we have, if you look around the room that you're in, everything came from the earth in some way, whether it's made from living materials, textiles and wood and that kind of thing, or whether it's made from what we call technical materials in circular economy speak. So metals, minerals, things from plastic, anything from fossils and so on, chemicals. Then everything starts off as having come from the earth. Whether it's been there for several thousand years or billion years, or whether it's something that's only been created in the last few weeks, it all starts with the earth. And as our population is growing exponentially, it's obvious that we can't keep on growing our consumption in that world of finite resources. And those of you who are who've been interested in sustainability for quite a while will know that lots of things are under pressure like never before. Species extinction, putting at risk some of the services that we depend on for our survival. We tend to forget that living things clean up our water, give us fresh air, give us pest control, pollination, and much, much more. And we forget that at our peril. So I've started thinking about, well, how do we go beyond circular? And this is a manifesto that I published on the website recently and did a blog around. So we think businesses should be fair. So FAIR, so F standing for fair trade, fair labor, and paying fair taxes. So doing business in a fair way and treating your employees fairly. A is for authentic, so being open, honest, and trustworthy, telling the story of what you've been able to do that's better, and also being honest with what you've not yet been able to solve, because we can't do everything at once. I is for inclusive, and by that we mean the ownership of the company. So we like to see employee cooperatives, employee ownership, social enterprises, that kind of thing, moving to much more of a business that's owned by the people who are working in it rather than by those shareholders, and who can turn into activists pushing for short-term results, as we heard about earlier. And then the last one is regenerative, and I think we need to go further than circular. We've already lost a lot of the things that we depend on, so we need to regenerate resources, living systems, and of course communities. We've been destroying communities as we've taken jobs away from people, as we've some companies have poisoned the environment around their production sites. So we've got all of that to restore as well. And regenerative can be regenerating living systems like regenerative agriculture, agroforestry, and permaculture solutions. And it can also be regenerating the resources that we need, so metals and minerals. We can even get involved in urban mining to bring back some of the materials that we think we've lost. And so things that we like at Rethink are donut economics. We think that's a really good tool to use. And it's great to see that cities like Amsterdam are starting to use that now as a way to guide their policies going forward. And we like the 4 system conditions from the natural step, which is a science-based methodology that evolved in the 1990s. It's all open sourced, and they have lots of good tools on their website. And they frame these 4 system conditions, so 3 relating to resources and 1 relating to society. And they break those down in a little bit more detail. And we like to turn those around so that instead of talking about what we shouldn't do, we talk about what we should do. So we've just kind of, turned the words into something more positive. And I think the clause that we often forget about is this one around the man-made substances. So the natural step talk about, that we shouldn't be polluting the earth with man-made substances, things like VOCs and toxins and lots of man-made chemicals. And we forget that many of the chemicals that are in use today haven't been tested. And if they are tested, they're tested in isolation, not in combination with the things that are probably in the product they're going to be used in. And so I think there are lots more stories to emerge for things that are in general use today that turn out to be toxic. And the circular economy, there are different schools of thought, as you probably know, and they tend to share these common principles. So it's about designing products so they last longer and can be repaired, and ideally so they can be shared. So if you're going to put something, say a bicycle or a car, into a sharing pool, it needs to be easy for people to use. There's no point in asking somebody to do something where they've got to read the instruction book for 10 minutes before they can work out how to unlock the bike or get the car started. We think it's important to emphasize using safe, sustainable materials. And we mean safe for humans and living systems at every stage. So from extraction, through production, through use, and at end of use. There shouldn't be anything in there that's poisonous to us or to nature. And what do we mean by sustainable? So it's either recycled and recyclable, or it's renewable within the product's lifetime. So if I'm going to cut down a tree to make a table, I need the table to last as long as it takes the tree to regrow. And we need different business models in the circular economy as well. Business models that encourage people to use things instead of needing to own them. And there are lots of different business models, and I've done some big updates to that chapter in the 2nd edition of the book, using some much more recent research, looking at 3 different models, and we'll come back to those. And then another key principle is that there shouldn't be any waste. We should design waste out, and all waste should be food for another process, either for another industrial process or a nutritious food for nature. So, a proper compost. And I don't mean composting plastics just so they become microplastics. And so this is my version of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation butterfly diagram, showing the loops in a simpler way. And we need to remember that the loops in the center are the ones where we recover most of the value. And this shows the three groups that can be involved in the circular economy. So we've got the original brand or manufacturer, we've got specialist circular providers, so specialist recyclers, companies that are remanufacturing other brands' products, companies that are repairing, refurbishing, and so on, and obviously companies that are reselling other people's products. And then we've got us, peer-to-peer services. So we can get involved in reselling, in sharing, and so on, even if it's something as simple as eBay. And as I said, we need to remember the tightest loops are the ones that are most important. So we should avoid just focusing on recycling and really think about how we can slow things down and keep products in the system for much longer. This is the framework that I developed for the first edition of the book, and I've done some minor updates for the second edition. So what I tried to do was break down the supply chain and think about each of the different parts of the supply chain where you could intervene to make something more circular. So different business models, as we just mentioned, thinking about how you design the product so that it's going to be repairable, so it's more durable, and so that you can properly disassemble it and recycle it at the end of use. Thinking about those safe, sustainable inputs, what's going to go on the bill of materials. And then what about the process? How can you eliminate waste from the process and make sure that everything's either going back into your own system or can be food for another industrial process? And then what happens to the product at the end of use? How can you get it back and get it into your system again to be reused? And then underpinning that are enablers and accelerators. So enablers are things that you can do within the business. So different ways of thinking, maybe using green chemistry, biomimicry, systems thinking, and so on. Different technologies that you might be able to use. So digital, maybe using platform apps or using sensor technology so that you're keeping an eye on the condition of the products you put into the market. And also new material inventions that are coming along. So those are enablers that they're not circular in themselves, but they help you do things in a more circular way. And then accelerators are things outside the company that again can help you be more circular. So they might be collaborations, it might be policies and taxes, or it might be certifications that you can use to make sure that you are using safe and sustainable materials. And so in the book, I go through that framework in each of the chapters on different sectors. So there's a chapter on food, fashion, consumer technology, industrial processes, and then packaging. And we follow that framework and look at different initiatives and examples at each stage. And so to summarize the circular economy and think about it in kind of more strategic ways, I like to contrast it with the linear economy, which, as Philip mentioned, it's a one-way system. So we extract materials, we make something, we use it, and then we chuck it away. And we could even call it a waste economy. So in contrast, the circular economy, we're looking to do three things really. Either slow the flow, so we want things to stay in the system for longer, so we're slowing down the flow of resources through the system. Or we can intensify the loop by making something reusable and shareable so that we get more productivity out of the same product. And to give a simple example, if we think about cars, in Europe, the average car is parked up for 23 hours a day. So that's an awful lot of unused productivity. If we were to put that into a car sharing system, then we might use it for 8, 12, even 18 hours a day and get a lot more use out of those same materials. So we can do either or both of those strategies. And we always want to have the third strategy, in which is closing the loop and regenerating the materials and living systems that we need for the next cycle of products. But we shouldn't just focus on that and that alone. We need to do something to slow down the flow of resources and lighten our footprint on the earth. Otherwise, we're not going to get any further. And so just to quickly skip through those. So slowing the flow is about reusing, repairing, and keeping the product in the system. Intensifying the loop is all about sharing. So paper use, rental, leasing, reselling, that kind of thing. And then closing the loop and regenerating is getting the product back and getting it into the system at one of the earlier stages. And when we think about why we've arrived at this kind of situation, it seems to me to come from these business models that are all about selling more. How do we become more successful as a company? Well, we need to grow bigger, so we need more revenue. And how do we do that? So we can either make things cheaper so that we can underprice the competition, or we can come up with new models and practice planned obsolescence, convincing people that they need the latest model so that we can sell more that way. Or we can make it difficult to repair things, all these kind of tactics. And you can argue that people have done that maybe accidentally, just in the bid to make things cheaper or sell more. But I think also lots of companies are doing that on purpose, and have been caught out doing that. And as Douglas Rushkoff, who's done some great books and does a really good podcast, as he says, when we pay too little for things, it means something nasty is going on behind the scenes. And really, we can't afford the true cost of what we think we deserve. So we need to question what we're being told that we need. Most of it isn't what we need. It's just what we're being persuaded that we should be buying. And we often forget that the shopping buzz doesn't last very long. So we're all persuaded, and we shouldn't forget that there are, very well qualified people with lots of PhDs spending all their time thinking about how they're going to persuade us to buy this, or, experience that, or, sign up to this platform. And they're getting really, really sophisticated at it. But we forget that the buzz of having pressed that button or bought that thing doesn't actually last very long at all. And so that, there's an interesting Greenpeace report there. And I think that what we're doing as a society now is moving from this consuming culture into a culture where we're starting to care more about what we're buying, how it's made. Do we even need it? And if I do need it, could I buy a second-hand one instead? Could I rent it? And if I am going to buy it, how's it made, and where in the world, and was that person paid the living wage? And so people are getting a lot more interested in what's behind the label. And how do we, if we're going to be on a mission to try and do this for ourselves, whether that's in our businesses or with our friends, with our colleagues, then how do we start? And really, we can only start to make a difference to something if we really understand it. Otherwise, we've all been there, haven't we? We've got caught out with talking about something that we've heard on the radio, and then somebody asks us a difficult question and we've not been able to answer it, and we feel a bit daft, and we kind of decide we're not going to stick our heads above that parapet anymore. So I think it's about deciding what we're going to focus on, and then understanding that better. So we're moving from this position of confusion to one of clarity, where we understand the basics and we understand the system that's around that thing. And then once we've got that right, it's more C's. So we move to a mindset where we're starting to care about that thing, whether that's deforestation or less plastics or whatever it is. So we're starting to care deeply about it. And then we can have conversations with people at work, with our families, with friends, and so on, and start to try and get other people's perspective on that. Why are they doing things the way they're doing it? And can we shift them to different behavior and help them care about it? And then we can go further and start to challenge. So we might be writing to our governments. We might be campaigning on social media. We might be writing to the companies that we like, but we can see they're not really doing the right thing. And so the kind of the takeaway message is that the circular economy is about much more than recycling. And I'd ask all of you to um, look at the companies that you're favoring and think about whether they are doing something meaningful to slow the flow. Are they making things shareable? Are they making things more durable, repairable, things that have value when you finish with them so that you can resell them? Or is it just, a bit of greenwash about some recycled materials? We need to be raising the bar with all of these companies. And it's about moving from, doing less bad to doing more good, moving away from that waste economy where not only do we waste resources, but we're creating pollution and waste at every single stage of the supply chain, into the atmosphere, into the air, into soil and water, destroying what we depend on. And moving to that circular system where we keep products in the loop for much longer and we keep the value from the product and we gain lots as a business from doing that. And as Yvonne Chouinard said, if we're part of the solution, not part of the problem, then it's a lot easier to go to sleep at night. So that turned into rather a long section, but hopefully that's given you a feel for the kind of things that are in the book, and also the focus of what I'm doing now, which is trying to raise the bar on the circular economy and help companies do things that are truly sustainable for the long term, not just a bit less bad. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much for your presentation. Now is the time to actually post some questions. If you have questions, feel free now to come along. I definitely have some questions, but I hold back a little bit to see who else would like to ask you some questions. So post them in the chat, and feel free to. There's one question already. Let's see. Okay. Regarding ESG funding, you mentioned ESG funding earlier. What can be done now to stop misused ESG metrics contributing to greenwashing? First question. If a fossil fuel company scores highly on the governance aspects, but continues to extract oil and gas, how do we rate investment in it? So maybe we keep with that question first.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and I think there are lots of funds starting to wonder that as well. It's as an investment fund I was talking to, who will be appearing on the podcast soon, Circularity Capital. We were talking about how actually you could, in theory, have a circular barrel bomb. So even circular is not the solution. And I know the big for accounting consultancies are trying to come up with a methodology for scoring ESG funds. So I guess they're thinking there's some money in doing that, auditing that scoring, but I think it's going to be really difficult. And maybe it's more about looking at the companies that you think can make a positive impact, and trying to find impact investing rather than companies that are able to tell a good story about their governance or their environmental improvements, which might just be about doing a bit less bad.
Okay, and there's already another question regarding bioplastics. Also very good topic. If there's no effective way to separate and compose bioplastics, will they lead to consumer confusion? So quote. When the chat moved, contaminated recycling and ultimately more problems than they solve.
Yes, and I think that's already happening. Certainly in the UK, we already have lots of packaging that's industrial compostable in industrial processes, which means they have to get really hot. But there's hardly any access to those processes. So people are perhaps putting them in their garden waste bin or putting them in with plastic packaging or whatever it is. And of course, all that does is contaminate things. So I think really it comes back to the policy changes. We shouldn't be allowing companies to put things into the marketplace that can't easily be recycled. And we should be charging companies to do that. In the UK, we have a packaging waste tax, which is part of the European legislation, but that only brings in about 10% of the cost of local councils collecting all the recycling waste. So of course they don't have enough money to do the separation properly. There's no money left to invest in recycling facilities for those complex materials and so on. We let companies put plastic in packaging into the marketplace, which is made of multiple materials and all sorts of stuff. And I just don't see why we should. Why is it right that companies should be able to put something into the market that society and taxpayers pick up the bill for, or even worse, it destroys the environment that we all depend on? That just doesn't seem right.
Big topic. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Thank you
Mm.
for your statement. We have another question, also highly interesting. How can we promote the message of that we need to move to more regenerative thinking if a lot of business haven't even understood the circular economy approach?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for whoever posted that in. So yeah, I think it's a toughie, isn't it? And I think it's about some of the fundamentals. So maybe those of us who are talking about the circular economy need to remember to explain the context of it. So we're not just focusing on the mechanics and the principles of circularity, but we're focusing on some of the examples and talking about how they do or don't really solve the problem. So I came across a couple of examples in the last week or so. One was a shoe manufacturer that had made a slipper with a kind of fluffy woolly bit on it, and they were proudly telling us how that fluffy bit was made from recycled sugar cane. And it was, lurid colors, so it didn't look as if it could have been natural dyes. It was, probably toxic chemical dyes. But is that sustainable? We all know that sugar isn't really a sustainable crop. So is doing something that provides some extra revenue to the sugar industry and helps them be more profitable, is that a good thing? It is circular, but is it a good thing? So I think we need to start thinking about the systems picture and thinking about how this initiative, whatever it is we're looking at, how is that going to make a better world? um, you know is it moving us forward, or is it just somebody doing something that probably helps them put a good story out, might be a cheaper raw material for them, so all they've done is kind of added to their bottom line by badging something as circular and sustainable in quotes.
Thank you so much. We have one more question already. While recycling is the long loop with low value creation potential, would it still be considered useful as an option for recovering cheap materials at the end of life and reuse in manufacturing?
Yeah, great question, and I think that is a good point. Certain things, perhaps like PET bottles, are perhaps more suitable for recycling than for refilling, because even the process of getting them back to refill them and make sure they're clean, that's quite energy intensive as well. And I think there's a similar question around some of the fabrics in fashion, that for if fast fashion is going to stay, is there a way of reducing its footprint by making those materials easy and cheap to recycle? So I think in some cases, recycling is a reasonable option, but we really need to make sure that materials are going back into the same products, and that there isn't a better way of getting those refilled. So if we take the plastic bottles example, is it really better to have plastic bottles that's where we can't control the flow and we can't ensure that everything stays in the system, and maybe there's not enough value in the bottle to offer a deposit scheme to keep them in the system? Would it be better to go back to glass, that's recyclable more easily, and by more companies, and where it's easier to keep those out of landfill and oceans and water and so on? So I think every material really needs a different approach, and that's where policy can really help to guide those decisions for businesses.
Thank you so much. One more question, saying, hi, Catherine. Thank you so much for your sharing your experience. I absolutely agree and can only underline that. Regarding the sustainable consumption, how do you think developing countries to adapt sustainable product usage, as most of the sustainable products could be pricey and might not be affordable to less fortunate?
Yeah, thank you. That's another good point. And I think as part of the FAIR manifesto that I talked through, thinking about how do we ensure a just transition for every economy. So definitely for lower income countries, um, where there might be opportunities for them to leapfrog, but we need to make sure that we don't do things in developing economies or in that make it worse. So um, you know, giving them all our waste to recycle when they don't have the technology to do it, and so on. Um, so I think this whole question of affordability is an interesting one. And there are two angles to this. I've seen people complain about the rebound effect of circular economy, because if we're going to resell phones, that makes them more affordable for everybody. And therefore, there are more phones in the world than there would have been otherwise. And so more energy used to charge those phones and send the signal and so on. And that doesn't really seem an ethical approach to me. I think if something's available, then we should make it accessible. So perhaps what we need are the different business models that make things more affordable, because you're getting the use of the product instead. So we can make things shareable, rentable, and so on. And we can also do things like if we take an approach like Fairphone have done, where we're making a phone that's modular, so that means it's easy to upgrade. That helps keep the whole phone in the system at the current level of technology for a lot longer. So if a better processor comes along or a better camera lens comes along, you can just pay to upgrade that one part instead of having to buy a new phone. So I think there are lots of ways of making things more affordable. And I think perhaps in the next few years, the companies that are focusing on doing that will be the ones that win out. And a good example, just to extend that answer a little bit more, a great example, which was featured on a podcast of mine. So um, episode 41, I think it is 41 or 42, with Algramo in Chile. And they were featured this week in a blog by the World Economic Forum. So Algramo set out to solve the poverty tax. And what they meant by that was that in Chile, in the cities and towns where people are in housing that's all squashed together, people end up shopping at convenience stores. They can't afford to go miles to a big supermarket. They don't have a car to bring back lots of bags of shopping, so they end up shopping at convenience stores and having to buy small boxes of washing powder or small um, washing up liquid and shampoo and all that kind of stuff, so they can carry it home more easily. But the founder of Algramo realized that that meant they were paying about 2.5 times as much for the product as if they'd gone to the supermarket and bought a bigger container. And so Algramo then designed reusable packaging to help solve that poverty tax. And they're now working, so this was a startup, they're now working with brands like Unilever, Colgate Palmolive, P&G, I think, and so on. And they've expanded out of Chile, and they're working with those brands to put reusable packaging into convenience stores around the world. And now, if you go to the convenience store, you're getting better value for the product in the packaging than you would be if you were buying it from a supermarket. So there are, if you think about the system and you think about what you're actually trying to do for your end customer, you can perhaps come up with a different way to solve the problem.
Thank you very much. Now I can ask a question. There's for now no other question in the chat, but a comment saying that happens here in Ohio. There's a Dollar General in every small town with no other options, typically, like saying this, what you mentioned earlier. I actually have a question regarding the donut economics or economy that you mentioned earlier. Fascinating concept, and I heard about the case now that they are talking about it or doing it actually in Amsterdam. And you had a slide earlier, and maybe you can mention a couple of things about the donut economics a bit, if you want to, and how
Mm.
can that how does that relate to making maybe also cities more circular or more sustainable? So where's the link? Because for now we have been talking about companies and all these kind of things. So um, the donut economics they apply to also cities. So this would be very interesting for me to go back to.
Sure. Do you want me to show the donut slide again?
That would be nice.
Okay. Uh, so
I think you have to. Yeah, yeah. Okay,
yeah.
perfect. Yeah, yeah, that's the one.
Okay. So for those of you who are not familiar with the donut, so the donut bit is this, and Kate Raworth is an economist, and she was working at Oxfam, and she came across something that you might have heard of called the planetary boundaries, developed by the Stockholm Resilience Institute. And there's some really great stuff on their website. If you go to stockholmresilience.org, I think it is. So there are various films and so on. And so a group of scientists around the world had been working on trying to establish the boundaries. What were the limits to our safe operating space, if you like, on the Earth. And so obviously we know about greenhouse gases and the effect of that on climate change and the atmosphere and warming and so on. But there are lots of other barriers. And so they've been trying to work out the limits for all of these, ozone issues. They were going in the 90s. We managed to make a big difference to that. Air pollution, loss of biodiversity, something that's not often talked about, but runoff from farming and other emissions from farming. So overloading the safe levels of nitrogen and phosphorus in the system, chemical pollutions, and so on. And so they worked out safe limits for each of these. And Kate Raworth saw that and thought it was a brilliant framework, and then started thinking more and thinking about the work that she was doing on the Soul Foundation for Oxfam, and thinking about what people needed for um, a an acceptable standard of living. What should we be aiming for everybody around the world? So access to education, access to being able to vote, gender equality, being able to have safe housing, access to electricity and clean water, and obviously being able to get enough food. And so she decided to try and come up with metrics for those as well. And in the middle, in between the ecological ceiling, as she called it, and the social foundation, is what Kate calls a safe operating space for humanity. So where we should all be aiming to be, so that we're not going beyond the ecological ceiling, not overshooting those safe planetary limits, and not going below the minimum social foundation. And as Philip said, the city of Amsterdam and a few others, I think, now are using this as a framework to guide their decisions. And they're very much thinking not just about what happens within the city, but about their impact elsewhere in the world. And so if Amsterdam buys green beans from Kenya, let's say, are the people there all above that social foundation? Is anything happening in those farming practices that's going to overshoot the ecological ceiling and therefore have an impact on the environment in Kenya and wider? And if Amsterdam's going to export some of its waste, again, how's that being dealt with? Are those people that are going to process the waste, are they able to work in safe conditions? Have they got the technology to separate it, or is it being, burnt to access metals? So all those kind of decisions about the policies that the city is going to take moving forward. And I think the donut, they're finding that it gives them a really good toolkit. And there's a couple of documents they put online, one about how they're using the donut, and another one about their circular economy strategy as a city. So those would be useful to go and look up. And the donut, there's a donut economics action lab as well that Kate's done called Deal. So you can find out that about that and keep in touch with what's happening with the donut.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Andreas just posted a link also in the chat, donuteconomics.org. Plus tools and stories 92 shows you how you can downscale to donuts to your city. Thanks, Andreas, for that link. Yeah, I have one more question about the fair manifesto that you mentioned earlier. What is it exactly about, and where can we go to sign it if we can sign it?
Oh yeah, good question. Well, I've not made it signable, but I guess I could. So it's just really the way that we at Rethink want to approach things, and what kind of businesses we want to see, and what kind of businesses we think we want to support in the future. So really, it was me wanting to describe the beginning, I suppose, of going beyond circular, and that's kind of what I'm working on now. Is how do we raise the bar on circular? How do we make sure we don't end up with lots of circular barrel bombs and circular slippers that are not really moving us in the right direction at all. Because as we all know, we've not got long to bend the curve on emissions and bend the curve on some of the other crises. And so, what I guess lots of people who've worked with me over the years, particularly at DHL, would describe me as challenging, not necessarily in a good way. But I think we all need to be challenging. There's a saying that if you don't stand for something, you fall for anything. So yeah, we all need to be challenging behavior that we don't think is heading us in the right direction.
Yeah, good words. That's always great. I love that statement. No, she just quoted. Yeah, so I think now we can round up today's event. We're having a little bit of overtime. Before in jumping the gun, there's one more question. I obviously don't want to cut that out, but after that we will have to slowly say this is it, and then who wants to stay? I'm happy to stay a little bit longer, but then we also would like to um, stay a bit within the time limit. But don't worry, don't be sorry. Let me just go quickly to the question. In the UK, there's a discussion of net zero, the green recovery, and some on the circular economy. How can we break down these silos in sustainable thoughts or in sustainable thought?
Well, yeah,
Good
that's
question.
that's
Thanks.
a big and tricky question. Um, I guess it comes back to systems thinking, and I'm not quite sure how we start to convince the policymakers. Um, but yeah, the podcast that's going out on Sunday is with somebody who used to work at Cargill, and he talks a lot about silo thinking and how that kind of um, slowed down or even killed a lot of innovation. And I guess there's a big risk that that can happen in the UK. And maybe what we need to do is, go back to that slide that I talked about where we move from confusion to clarity, and make sure that people understand the bigger picture. So if we're going to net zero, how does that also help the circular economy? How can the circular economy help net zero? Because we know that manufacturing and extraction manufacturing and production of materials accounts for over half of our greenhouse gases. So how can we kind of bring all these different strands together? And I think it's just by making those links so that whenever we talk about one thing, we remind everybody that this is linked to it as well. So we mustn't forget that aspect of it. But yeah, I think lots of challenges for the UK, and I can see lots of siloed thinking and kind of vanity projects and all sorts of stuff on the horizon, unfortunately.
Thank you. There's actually one more question. Let's take it also, but basically two. Let's do it. Will this recording? Yes, this recording will be available. That was a quick question. And then one more comment. The challenge is also not to scare away people who already do some good steps, but being very demanding. Yes, Andreas is saying that. We should care about them as well. I think we need to be some good bridges. Thank you for that comment. Yeah, and that's what you mentioned earlier, no? That we shouldn't depreciate the small steps. Something you said on the when it came to the manifesto. I think you had something there
Yeah,
mentioned.
and I think it is fine to take baby steps. we just need to make sure that those are steps in the right direction. So I think, the example of the slippers and the sugar cane, that's not really a worthwhile step. If they'd done something to use, wool, which in the UK, you can only give wool away. There's no value in wool at all. So why not use wool and why not use natural dyes? And that would have made an even better story. Um, so it can still be that baby step of just changing one thing, but make sure it's really heading in the right direction, and it's going to still be a good decision in the future if things change.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks to everybody for all your great questions. But as every good thing, there's always an end to everything. So now we just have the closing left for today. And yeah, first of all, I would like to invite everybody to actually get the book. It's great, and you can get deep insights on the circular economy. And she made available a 20% discount, and you will get the slides also if you after in the follow up. So you will get the links, and you can make sure you get the discount. And also, we mentioned the circular economy podcast, and you see the link here too. And she mentioned also there's a new episode coming up, so stay tuned, subscribe, and there's plenty of funds to go back. So if you want to actually have a course on circular economy, basically there you go. You have a podcast and way lots of materials to learn already from. And talking about courses, that's a good hint for me and for us as a school. We have a club, and you can join our club, the Sustainable Soros Club. We have some free courses in the free membership. We have discounts. We have also monthly coaching credits. So if you want to have some talk about sustainability and see how you can make some small steps in your business and follow up on certain things. And as you know, in the event we had the discount for the permaculture design course, something we didn't really have the chance to talk about too much about, because permaculture is quite in line with all the concepts we talked about, and Catherine is also quite involved in permaculture and has knowledge on that. But we leave that maybe for next time. It's also good to have things to have something to go back on. So make sure you have knowledge on permaculture too if you want to transform your world. You can also do the course with us. So feel free to have a look on the website. And that's basically it from my side. I'm just here to say thank you in all kinds of ways. And most of all, thank you, Catherine, for your time and for sharing great insights. Yeah. And for everybody who came and wanted to share this little time of the day with us. Thanks to everybody too much.
Thanks, Philip. Thanks for everybody for listening and some great questions.
Okay, so everybody stay safe, take care, and become more circular. With that, I say bye bye.